been a while since I've done one of these quick takes, which is intended to help people who are struggling with, we could call them philosophical difficulties or difficulties about philosophy, especially if they're at a beginner or intermediate stage in their studies. And the one that I'm going to talk about here is something I've talked about in many other places. AMAs have done presentations on this. And it's something that I see tripping quite a few people up rather unnecessarily. And it's worrying too much about the supposed difference or divide between something that we call analytic philosophy on the one hand and something that we contrapose to it called continental philosophy on the other hand. And this is something that really took off in the 20th century. It's something I would say that's more characteristic of the Anglosphere, so Great Britain, America, other places that are speaking English. And it's not complete nonsense, but it's also something that a lot of people get really mixed up about and think they've got a handle on when they really don't, because these terms, analytic and continental, these are at such a high level of abstraction that sometimes the way people are using them, they don't really refer to anything that you can easily identify and truthfully say these are the characteristics of it. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And you might say, well, why are you talking about this now in particular? We go through kind of waves where every so often, particularly in social media, people in philosophy and people who are, we could say, loosely attached to philosophy. They aspire to study philosophy, but maybe don't spend much time actually doing so, get to talking about the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. And sometimes it's rather sedate, analytic philosophies like this, continental philosophies like this. And sometimes it's quite bitter and angry and hostile, and unnecessarily so, I would say. So just recently, there was a rather stupid article by a attention-seeking Substacker that set things off yet once again and led to a whole bunch of other people writing in their own blogs, some in Substack, some people doing videos about it, a lot of discussion in Twitter and other places about it as well. And I would say, now, of course, nobody can survey all of this in its totality, but from my vantage point, and remember, I tend to block people who I think are just trolls or stupid or a waste of conversational space. This was a discourse that was not particularly edifying. It probably makes philosophers look bad to people on the outside in some respect and dissuades people from actually wanting to study and appropriate philosophy, because a lot of the stuff that people had to say was poorly informed or not very well thought through. There were a lot of stabs at here's what we can say about analytic philosophy, here's what we can say about continental philosophy that I would say were maybe partly on point and then largely off base. And so I thought, I probably should say something about this because I get people asking me about this pretty consistently. I won't say all the time, but it often comes up in my monthly AMAs. I get people asking about this in my classes and a number of other places as well. And it's been going on for a very long time. I was even brought in to give a talk on the continental analytic divide about 10 years ago, specifically because they thought I would have something useful to say about it. And I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit here. I'm not saying I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this stuff, but I'm probably better qualified than a lot of other people who are jumping in for a couple reasons. One is I have a background in both analytic and continental philosophy because, I went to places that were what we call pluralistic, meaning that you studied different schools of philosophy. They weren't just analytically oriented or continentally oriented or some of the other options that we'll talk about soon. There were presences in all of them, and we had to be able to learn how to talk across these divides, to learn the lingo of people sitting across from you. And I was interested in philosophy of language when I started graduate school. So analytic philosophy, big in that. Continental philosophy, big in that. So I was actually digging into all of it. And I was even doing that as an undergraduate. Being a mathematics and philosophy major, interested in how language and mathematics work together and logic, I got quite a good background. And I got to see some of in the 1990s, the remaining hostility between the two camps. The APA was still very analytic at that time. It's not really that anymore. SPEP, the Society for Existential and Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy. That's where the Continentals were, unless you wanted to go more radical. And they'd often talk crap about each other. Often, I got to see a lot of that, and I also got to see whether it was true or not. And some of it was, there would be like, we're not going to hire these people. As a matter of fact, just to give you an idea about how acrimonious things could be, one of the graduate schools that I applied to at the time, so this had been in 1994, for starting in 1995, they wrote me back and said, well, we're not taking any new students because we had a big rift in our department and one faction just left, so we don't have enough graduate faculty to take in new students. It was the Continentals who won and the Analytics left. In other places, Analytics would push other Continentals and other people out of their departments. But that sort of thing, it still does happen occasionally. People are jerks to each other, but that's not really the landscape of the present. So in any case, I've gotten to see this and think about it. And the other thing that I'll say that maybe helps to qualify me, I'm not committed to either one. I'm not an analytic. I'm not a continental. I do history of philosophy, a lot of European philosophers, philosophy as a way of life, and I've got a background in an appreciation of all sorts of philosophical approaches. So, that said, I think if we look at things from the vantage point of the present, you can use the words analytic and continental to name something that's usually rather vague, but also we could say, sociologically does characterize places. The majority of American philosophy departments, at least in universities, I would say small liberal arts colleges, community colleges, probably not the case. But at least like the bigger places, the majority, not the absolute majority, not everyone, but quite a few of them, most of the people there, if they're not foreigners who studied something else in France or Brazil or wherever, are going to have been trained in something that's very broadly analytic philosophy, right? And, we can say that there are places that also are much more continentally oriented. So there is something there. But these are, very, very broad strokes. And knowing that X school has analytic philosophers doesn't really tell you that much until you start descending to particularity and saying, okay, what are these people into? Who are they reading? What questions, what issues are they talking about? Are they interested in overlaps between what they view as analytic philosophy and other discourses that are happening in other fields or in other subdisciplines or traditions of philosophy? Sometimes we associate them with particular canons, and this is where it gets kind of silly and funny. Sometimes people be like, you analytics, you all love Saul Kripke. hardly anybody reads Kripke these days. He was a big deal, the way we have big deals all the time back, when I was in graduate school. Even, David Lewis was a big deal back then. There are people still doing possible world semantics, but I don't think people are making these guys a common reference point. Bertrand Russell was an analytic from much earlier. Wittgenstein, certainly contributed to analytic philosophy in important ways, but he's not emblematic of it. Analytic philosophy names a whole bunch of interesting approaches that developed over a, century-long history, more than century-long. And sometimes we're arguing with each other, and sometimes we're, engaged in all sorts of interesting research projects. Continental philosophy is an even bigger mess. It's, if analytic philosophy at least has one sort of coherent history, which we'll talk about, which spiraled off in different directions, continental philosophy was something that was identified later on. And it names, phenomenological approaches and Marxist/Hegelian/critical theory approaches and structuralism and post-structuralism and a bunch of other things as well. So, it's not so neat and tidy as a lot of people would try to pretend. In the early 2000s, and I know this from experience, people trained in analytic philosophy started talking about post-analytic philosophy, meaning that there really wasn't any coherent tradition anymore, that people working in analytic philosophy of action and analytic philosophy of mind were using some of the same approaches and terminology, but they couldn't agree on what the words even meant. Like externalism might mean something in this context, and it means something very different over here. And people weren't reading each other's things. They weren't reading across all of these separate little projects. Continental philosophy, an even bigger mess, right? So some people want to talk about post-continental philosophy, but that's sort of like, Gretchen's fetch in Mean Girls. You can try to call anything you want, but, it may not stick, right? So, that's a little bit about the present. I think that it's really, really important. If you're interested in this sort of thing, you've got to avoid simplistic, dichotomous thinking that starts at these very high levels of generality, because most of these analytics are like this, but continentals are like this, are as stupid as the characterizations of men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I mean, what a dumb thing to think. If you have any actual experience with the range of men and women, you're not going to buy into that sort of thing. You may say, well, there's some trends, right? Analytics do seem to be more interested in argument than continentals do, but it's not like continentals don't make arguments or study logic or anything like that, right? And when it comes to clarity, people are like, oh, analytic philosophy aims at clarity. Well, so does a lot of continental philosophy. And a lot of analytics fail at clarity. So, these really broad characterizations, they're just going to get you in trouble. And why? Because they're essentially abstractions. They're anti-philosophical. They show whatever vector you're coming from, that you can't do philosophy well if those are the things that you're actually saying. And if other people are saying them, don't you believe them, because they're probably not going to be true. So, when people are like, analytics love logic and math and the sciences, and continentals love art and literature and music, well, G.E. Moore, if anybody's an analytic from way, way back, he liked reading novels more than he liked reading philosophy. Somebody who, jumping ahead a little bit, who was certainly analytically trained, arguably in their ambit. Iris Murdoch not only loved novels and thought they were important, and all sorts of other, art and literature. She wrote novels, right? So, these sorts of characterizations, when we descend from the lofty heights of generalities into looking at real stuff, they often turn out to be wrong. If you want somebody who's really concerned with argument, Jürgen Habermas, right? His books are full of them, and he's somebody who actually learned from analytic philosophers and drew upon them. So, any of these categorizations, if they're not properly qualified, they're bound to be both false, so they're not accurately depicting things, but they're also foolish. They make you stupid. So you don't want to buy into those. We can say, historically, that analytic philosophy in England emerges as a sort of response to a certain sub-current of what later gets called continental philosophy, Hegelianism, but in its British interpretations, right? And they're like, these guys are really unclear. We need to do things differently in philosophy. And then they try a number of new approaches to figure out how that might work. Like maybe everything can be understood in terms of logic and a logically perfect language. That's the Logicist project in part. Doesn't work. Maybe we'll look at ordinary language. Wittgenstein leads the way, and then you get, Ryle and Austin and people like that. Yeah, that's one other way to do it, right? So there is like a long, we could say, set of traditions, plural, that, analytic philosophy encompasses. Continental philosophy, it's identified after it exists. I mean, where is its starting point? Is it with Kant? Is it with the, German idealists? Does it go back maybe even a little bit further? Should we say Blaise Pascal, is a proto-continental or anything like that? I mean, there's no agreement on this. That's the point. People are identifying this later on, and it's always going to be from some sort of perspective. There's always going to be, hey, I think this is really essential, when other people will say, no, this is, so we can say continental philosophy is a little bit difficult to categorize in that way. But they do both have histories. They do both have canonical texts and thinkers who, I would say, most of the people who call themselves analytics and continentals give at best lip service to. They don't really read attentively and draw upon that much, even in continental philosophy. So many people blather about Hegel or Heidegger or Nietzsche who don't really have any business talking about them because they don't know them well, right? So that's important to think about. I mentioned Jürgen Habermas. He's an example of what we can call a bridge figure. If there really is this analytic versus continental divide, you're either on this side or this side, then what do you do with thinkers on both sides who read the other side and take them seriously? Jürgen Habermas is a great example of that. Ricoeur is another great example of that. In the rule of metaphor, he's citing analytic philosophers, right? So he's reading them. John Wisdom, great example of an analytic philosopher who thought, maybe psychoanalysis has something to it. I'll check it out. What about Jean-Paul Sartre's works? Iris Murdoch, who I brought up a little bit earlier. We could come up with all sorts of examples of this. So there's a lot of people who are crossing these boundaries. And why? Because, they're good philosophers. They want to actually study philosophy, and they're not concerned with, are you crossing into analytic territory? Ooh, that's bad. Or crossing into continental, land? Ooh, no, that's too obscure, or something like that. Because they're not stupid. Like a lot of the people who buy these, essentially myths of the divide. I would like to say as well that the supposed analytic continental divide is very parochial. It's sort of like being from some backwoods where your two football teams spar against each other, and you're either a proponent of this one or you're a proponent of this one. And then you get to the big city, and people are like, I don't care about either of your stupid football teams or your fan bases or stuff like that, because we got other stuff going on. So, there are a lot of places where people are doing analytic philosophy or continental philosophy and calling it that. But there's a lot of other stuff out there. I mentioned I'm a historian of philosophy. The whole history of philosophy is also philosophy. And neither the analytics nor the continentals do a particularly good job with that, with some exceptions. Robert Brandom, is a good analytic who, often ceases being kind of a typical analytic by paying attention to the text. The guy who I took history of philosophy classes with, who's probably less well known, Andrew Black, was a great historian of philosophy, though he was analytically trained up in Scotland. So there's, history of philosophy. There's philosophy as a way of life, big thing currently going on right now that often overlaps to some degree with history of philosophy. There's an entire classical American philosophical tradition that analytic philosophy came in the 50s and 60s and kind of displaced. That doesn't just include American pragmatism, but also, the early Puritan thinkers. Some people want to include some Native American texts and thinkers in there. Certainly what's called the American Renaissance and, the transcendentalists who are being influenced by, post-Kantian philosophy, coming through, say, Coleridge, and as well as a lot of other stuff. And then going on into other fields. We could talk about Africana philosophy, which includes African American philosophy, but also Caribbean and African philosophy. There's interesting overlaps with these. We can talk about, something like a radical philosophical tradition, that you can see associated with the Philosophy Born of Struggle conference, which often overlaps with all of these. We can also talk about stuff that, because it's from the continent, should be considered continental philosophy, but isn't by continental philosophy. And often they don't know anything about it. All this neo-scholastic or Thomist stuff from France and Germany and Italy from the, late 19th, early 20th century, continuing on with a strong Thomist tradition today, that's still philosophy, right? But it's not analytic and it's not continental. Although there are analytic Thomists, mainly centered around Eleanor Stumpf and people like that. I don't think they do, particularly good reads of Thomas. But there's overlaps there. We could talk about reflexive philosophy. And if you're like, I've never heard of reflexive philosophy, well, there's a good reason for it. Because you're not reading Maurice Blondel or Jacques Polliard or any of these other people who are from the continent, but aren't part of continental philosophy as we look at it here. So there's a lot of other things. And that's just Western philosophy. We could talk about all the great, other cultural spheres, the subcontinent, Indian philosophy. We can talk about, Chinese and, Korean and Japanese philosophy. And we can talk about comparative philosophy, where we're bringing together these different things and, comparing Aristotelianism with Confucianism, right? Or John Stuart Mill with some other later Indian thinker who's writing about liberation. Analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, they often don't know anything about this stuff, but you would like to, wouldn't you? So you don't want to be parochial and be like, which team do I have to pick? Which side? Because there's a whole wide world of interesting stuff to study, more than we have time for in our lifetimes. Even in something that is often said, well, this is definitely continental philosophy, the phenomenological movement. There's a continental, philosophy version of it, and then there's the actual phenomenological movement. So if you think phenomenology basically starts with Husserl, and then you get Heidegger, and Levinas, and Sartre, and then you get Derrida and Marion, okay, well, that's a little bit of the picture. But you're also missing the French people like, Bergson and, Maurice Blondel, who are doing things that are phenomenological and actually paving the way for phenomenology to come from Germany into France. And you're missing Max Scheler, who is just as important as Husserl or Heidegger to early phenomenology. And you're also missing all these great phenomenologists who, Jean Ehring, who people aren't really reading, or Edith Stein. The very first, discussion in the Société Thomiste in the 1930s, having their first, bring everybody in Europe together day, who did they engage with? The phenomenologists. And who did they bring as the representative? Edith Stein. So, even within continental philosophy, they often don't even know their own history. And if they don't, well, maybe we shouldn't be so concerned with, what they think real philosophy looks like. So I'm going to end this by saying, notice what I've been doing. We descended from the realm of abstractions, analytic, continental, and we said, what do these things actually mean? Who do they encompass? What sort of approaches are involved? And what's been left out? It turns out an awful lot. If you want to really make sense of, the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy and figure out which one would be good for you to study and pursue, and I encourage you actually to study both traditions, you might want to figure out some of these more middle level or lower level questions like, well, who should I actually study? And what am I going to get out of it? And who else or where else should I be looking? Rather than getting yourself involved in tiffs that are really going to go nowhere and characterizations that are bound to be, as I said, foolish or false, just do the work of actually studying philosophy and don't worry over much about which one do I have to pick, analytic or continental philosophy, or let alone, how can I bring the two of these together? You can worry about that when you've studied a lot more and maybe you've got something, useful to bring to the table. But until then, if you're up at this level, you're not going to get much purchase on the real stuff that winds up being at the lower levels. So those are my 2 cents. This isn't actually that quick of a take, but, maybe you find this useful. You can leave comments below and, let me know what you think about these matters. I'll also put a link to the invited talk that I gave at Virginia Commonwealth University about the analytic-continental divide and what analytics and continentals can learn from each other.